And then bizarrely, in the morning, I actually remembered that I'd said this weird word. And I thought that would be a really good title for a book. And that's actually how the word came into being. I don't know anybody else that's kind of used it before, but that's where it was for me. And really it is. Hagitude is, to me, it is an attitude.
Hello and welcome to the Mind, Body, Spirit Festival podcast. I am your host, Rach Cox, and I am thrilled to be interviewing some of the world's best known experts in spirituality and well-being. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. Dr Sharon Blackie is an award-winning writer, psychologist and mythologist. Her work is focused on re-imaging women's stories and on the relevance of myths, fairy tales and folk traditions to the personal, cultural and environmental problems we face today. As well as writing 6 books of fiction and nonfiction, including the bestselling If Women Rose Rooted, The Enchanted Life and Hagitude, her writing has appeared in several international media outlets and has been interviewed by, and you have been interviewed by the BBC, US Public Radio and other broadcasters on her areas of expertise. Sharon's next book, Wise Women, Myths and Folklore in Celebration of Older Women, will be published in 2024. Wowzers, look at you go.
Well, I've been around for a bit, I'm 63 now, so I guess I get to do things.
Yeah, well, you definitely got on with them.
I have got on with them, although actually all of that came late, that I started writing when I was 40.
Okay.
So all of it has come in the second half of my life.
Wonderful, which is must be the exact reason why you do what you do, because you came into your power then.
Yeah, I found menopause incredibly liberating. I mean, it's not that it was always comfortable, but it really was one of those times when everything I had kind of wanted to be seemed to happen because of that big change, that we all go through at that time.
Amazing. And so would you put your success down to your understanding and navigating of the menopause and that power it gave you?
Well, I think, I started writing and I started doing the work that I'm doing now, probably I would say in my early 40s. Mm-hmm. But I think there is still always a constraint of women, even in midlife, where we feel that we've got to be what other people want us to be, that we've got to please everybody, we've got to look the part. And I think that always constrained me a little bit. And it wasn't really until menopause and once I was through menopause that all of that started to slip away. And I think that really is one of menopause's superpowers, if we let it happen to us.
That's amazing. I can't wait.
Oh, good. Yeah, it's brilliant. I thoroughly recommend it. Not that you're going to have much of a choice, but,
Definitely don't have a choice, no. But it's always, growing up, for me, I've always thought or been told that, it's been a bit demonized and it's something to be scared of. And that after that, you don't really have much going for you as a woman. Whereas I hang out literally with 60 to 90-year-old women, and they are my favorite people in the world to be around.
I think the culture has got it completely wrong, what happens. But also that's part of the problem, because that's the story that we're told that we ought to live by once we get through menopause. We're supposed to be invisible, when really what we want to do is to be more visible, and albeit perhaps in a new way, we're supposed still to want to define ourselves by our attractiveness, by our looks. We're supposed to follow these cultural pressures that keep telling us we have to continue being what we were forever, otherwise we're failing. And most of the women I know who have a happy and kind of meaning-filled second half of life have just said, bugger that, I'm not doing that. That's just not going to happen. There's another way to be. And, from my perspective as a psychologist, it's supposed to be a change.
Yeah, and we often really resist change. So I'm guessing part of your methodology and advice is to not resist that change and harness it.
Absolutely. And that's what I wrote Hagitude for, to precisely not only get over that message, but also to offer up ways how it could be done.
Amazing. And for people who don't know what Hagitude is, it's a brilliant word. I absolutely love it. I feel like we've got a great Hagitude towards life right now. How would you describe it for those of the listeners who aren't familiar?
Well, this is a word that literally came to me in the middle of the night. So I woke up in the middle of the night and sat bolt upright and said Hagitude to the room and then went back to sleep again. And then bizarrely in the morning, I actually remembered that I'd said this weird word and I thought that would be a really good title for a book. And that's actually how the word came into being. I don't know of anybody else that's kind of used it before, but that's where it was for me. And really it is, Hagitude is to me, it is an attitude as we grow older, and it is that refusal to be silenced by others. It's that refusal to become obediently invisible. It's that refusal to be judged only by our appearances and by our utility to our partners, and to the culture, and to really define our own story.
Something that is definitely not encouraged anywhere other than with you.
So. Well, but it ought to be. I think, that if you look back, what I did in Hagitude is I looked back at older stories, fairy tales and myths, which offer up images of older women that are interesting, because I don't think we have a really good image of older women in the culture today, and that means that we don't have very many role models. And when that happens, although it might seem a bit weird, I always tend to go back to the old stories, because sometimes our ancestors knew stuff that we have forgotten. And so what I was trying to do there is look for evidence that there is life after menopause and that it can be quite interesting. And so, you find all of these really fascinating, sometimes very funny, always very feisty older women in these stories. And it just seems to me that if we want inspiration to say, look, there really is life after menopause, there's a whole array of them in fairy tales and myths who aren't really very well known, because we tend to focus on the hero's journey and the hero's story, or on the pretty Disney princesses. But there's lots of other women in there, and they're just they're not talked about. No. So that was my mission, to make sure that they were talked about.
Thank you. Good. The word hag, in, I guess, normal society would conjure up quite a negative image of a woman, because that's what the patriarchy has so wonderfully done for us, isn't it? Is to demonize and have an image of this powerless old witch, that basically, the hag is actually a valuable stage of life, which we are not embracing. And I just wanted to mention that the word hag in there, for lots of people, might be a little bit jarring, but I'm guessing you're reclaiming that and empowering it.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is reclaiming a title or a word that's been used against us. Sometimes that can work, but it can only work if that reclamation is based on something. And what's interesting about the word hag is that when you go to the old stories and you look at all of the women who are described as hags, who are there as hags, you find something very interesting about them, which is that they are only ever in the story because of who they are. They're not in the story because they're someone's mother or grandmother or wife. They might be, but that's not why they're in the story. They're in the story as a consequence of their own power and of their own way of being in the world, and of that unique gift that they bring to a particular situation. And to me, that is the epitome of what menopause ought to do for us if we allow it to happen. It's just not that we don't care about relationships. It's not about that at all. But it's just a time of life, I think, where we can let go of expectations that others might have of us and really think about who we are and who we want to be in, for most people who are lucky, what really is often as much as 3, possibly more decades of life.
Yeah, it's a really large chunk of life just to dismiss, really.
Exactly, yeah.
And stop growing. Yeah. What mythical or cultural hags have you sort of woven in or taken inspiration from that either we might know or might not know about?
Are you talking about kind of contemporary real life people as well, apart from the stories? Or?
Both, yeah.
Or both,
exactly.
Okay. Well, I mean, I don't want to give too much away of what's going to happen in the workshop, but one of the archetypal characters that has really affected my life is an old woman in the Scottish and Irish traditions who is called the Cailleach, which in that language literally means the old woman. And although in our old traditions we don't have a creation myth, there probably was one, but it wasn't written down, it was lost. But we have this story of an old woman creating the land and shaping the land. So there are all kinds of wonderful stories of her walking through a very, very early version of the earth, carrying stones in her pinny. And because she's a giant, old woman, when she trips over and the stones fall out of her apron, they make hills. And she carries this little hammer, kind of like an old-fashioned toffee hammer. You're probably too young to remember those, but you do remember them. Okay. But she kind of uses that to shape the valleys and the hills according to the way that she wants it. So we have this wonderful old woman who is also, as well as shaping the land and in some sense being immanent in the land, she is a guardian and protector of the land and of the creatures on it. So she stops hunters from taking pregnant deers and says, I'll give you a stag if you leave my pregnant deers alone. So there's this sense of an old woman just saying, no, can't do that. I'm not having it, but I'll negotiate with you. Here's something instead. And that had a huge impact on me around the time that I began to realize that the environmental crises were not going to go away and that something had to be done. So I think that sense of an old woman who's not only immanent in the earth, but who stands up for it is a really good role model for today in the old stories. And one of the women who's been a great influence on me pretty much since my 40s is Joanna Macy. I don't know whether you know Joanna Macy, but she's an American environmental activist who's also a Buddhist scholar, and she brought a lot of Buddhist ideas into environmental activism. And I don't know, I think she started I think she was born in like 1929. So she's been like an environmental activist for the best part of 6 decades. And she invented something called the work that reconnects, which was very much about bringing people back to a sense of being part of the natural world as opposed to above it. So although I wouldn't call Joanna a hag, she's too nice for the kind of like, the normal kind of feisty impression of a hag. There are older women out there. We've got to look for them sometimes. But there are older women out there who reflect some of these archetypal characters of the older women in the stories.
Nice. Yeah, I think a lot of empowerment can happen with these stories and retelling them. They're so enchanting and enthralling. And I can't believe, I don't really know many stories about hags, and they've been around for a very long time doing a lot of good stuff.
Exactly. I mean, there's the classic story that I always am surprised that people don't know is an old Russian story, or Slavic, really from the Slavic countries in general, of an old woman called Baba Yaga, who is kind of like the archetypical old woman in the woods, but she clearly is born. Her stories are born out of some old mythology of a mother goddess. There's no question about that, and she she lives in a house that is on chicken legs, so that it can run away if it feels like it, and you don't always find it in the same place. And she flies through the air in a mortar with a pestle to kind of like row through the air. Wow. She has servants who are the dawn and the sunset. She's very cosmological, kind of an old woman, but she is a very serious old woman. If you go to her wanting something, she will test you. And if you fail, she'll put you in her man-sized oven and eat you.
Oh, wow.
If you don't, if you do what she requires, if you pass the tests, and normally younger people, then you go away with whatever it was that you came for. But this sense as well in these old stories of old women who do actually have power of consequences, that this is real stuff that these older women are kind of advising on or testing younger people for. And although sometimes it doesn't seem to fit into a world where we want everything to be nice and lovey, that sense of you've really got to shape up, otherwise it's not going to go well for you, is one of those things that older women in stories, sometimes as vividly as Baba Yaga, other times by being a little bit more of a gentle mentor, also do. So there's all kinds of fascinating older women in these stories.
Really, yeah, bloody brilliant. What is a question that you get asked all the time, and how will you explore it, obviously without giving it away too much, at the workshop at Mind, Body, Spirit on the 27th of May?
Well, I think, I'm sorry, I've just lost, I had a note. Can you bear it if I...
No, of course, yeah, no worries.
I'm so sorry. I had because I never actually remember this, forgive me. I have a couple of notes here and I lost it. Hang on. Okay. Can I just go and somebody will edit that out?
Okay. Yeah.
So I think the main question that I get from older women, particularly if they haven't read Hagitude yet, some of the answers are in Hagitude, but particularly if they haven't really read Hagitude or delved into the kind of work that I do, is how can can I make the second half of my life meaningful?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's all very well to say that, but I don't even know what that would look like. And so I think really that what I will be talking about is how we embrace the second half of life, not in a kind of very general way, but specifically what kind of elder women are there in the world and what kind of elder women do we need? And part of that is going through this diverse collection of elder women in the old stories. There's not one single way to have a meaningful elderhood in the old stories. There's various ways of doing it. So we have characters like the fairy godmother, you know, the classic mentor to a young person. We have the old women, particularly in Greek mythology, the three fates, who are old women who literally weave the world into being. They keep the cosmos in balance. We have the old women like the Cailleach, who are guardians and protectors of the land. So there are a really wide range of ways of having a meaningful elderhood. And what I was really hoping in that grand research project that I did to look at old women throughout myth and folklore is that everybody would be able to see something of themselves in at least one of these stories. That somebody will be able to say, okay, that's my gift. I'm a really good mentor. Or no, I'd be a really good environmental activist. And lots of kind of like, you know, more subtle ways of being in between. So that sense of what does it actually look like, which I'm always asked, I think will be the focus of the workshop.
Okay. So they'll be able to take away some very sort of practical, but also, is it a discussion-based workshop as well?
Yes. And I think, you know, one of the reasons why I have always worked with stories in one way or another and began really to focus on that about 20 years ago is that stories capture our imagination. So as a psychologist, for example, when I was practicing psychology, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy, all of that kind of stuff, very, very wonderful, very effective in some ways, but it's not really very interesting. And so people often are, you know, they lack motivation because it's frankly boring and hard work. But a story always captures the imagination. And these stories show us different ways of being. So what I really want to focus on in the workshop is, what are these stories? How do these older women effectively make the world go round? Because that's the role they have in most of the stories. And how can we translate that into, you know, 2024 Britain? Yeah, exactly. Bringing it into the now so that people know what to do and not lose sight of themselves or hope, because it's definitely an experience growing older as a woman. It is. And yet, you know, if the world ever needed older women previously, I can't imagine what time that would have been. I think that sense of stability, that sense of, I'm just going to say it, that sense of empathy combined with that. I mean, it's a really fascinating combination, isn't it? That just sense of, no, I'm not having it. I'm going to say I'm not having it, but empathy at the same time. Yeah. And I think, frankly, that is a combination that many men struggle with. I think actually many women struggle with, because we're not allowed to do the feisty bit. But I think those qualities of actually being able to see the other person's story, the other person's perspective, but nevertheless just knowing when to say no, I think is a really very important and useful characteristic that older women have, and in a world that is so complex, you know, we need it. I mean, one of the most interesting older women characters that I have found in European literature, say the Grail romances are a classic one. There is a wonderful character called the Loathly Lady. That's very haggish for you. Who has, I don't know, she has boar tusks and eyebrows that reach down to her chest, and, you know, snakes for hair, and just not particularly beautiful by most standards of the day. But she rides out of the woods at an appropriate time and tells the so-called Grail hero all of the ways in which he is completely messing up, all of the ways in which he is useless, all of the ways in which he has no compassion, he hasn't done this right, he hasn't done that right, and she goes on and on and on and lays into him. And as a result of it, he's left thinking, oh my God, and actually goes and does the work and does exactly then what's needed. But this Loathly Lady is a character that I think of as a truth teller. But she, and we need that in the world today, but we don't need truth to be told just for the sake of it, willy-nilly. We need truth to be told when the truth can change something. And when the truth is also leavened with compassion. And I really do think that is something that women, as they grow older and wiser, inevitably, are quite good at.
Mm.
And we need that in the culture today.
Oh, we definitely do. Yeah, exactly. Take no prisoners, but have a little bit of compassion and empathy.
For sure. Yeah. Just know when to stand up like that old Kalia can say no.
Yeah, I love your use of the word feisty. It's one of my favourites, and I, you know, whether it's when you're getting older or when I was particularly young, I was incredibly feisty and really, really ostracised because of it. And you know, and I was like, I don't care. I don't care. I'm going to be feisty because that's what I am and believe. But it's something that has developed. I've seen like my nana was 82 when she went. She was one of my absolute idols. I've actually got a photo of her to show you. And she was the feistiest woman I've ever met in my life. And that's her on a bike with her middle finger up.
I love that.
And she was just like, I don't care, Rachel. I'm getting on it. I'm getting on there and you're going to take a photograph of me.
Wonderful. I had an aunt like that. I had a great aunt like that. So I grew up in the north of England and on the fringes of a very impoverished council estate where actually older women pretty much ran the show.
Well, that's where she lived. That's what she was from. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But isn't it interesting? And, you know, my great aunt Meg used to stand on the doorstep with her arms folded, voluminous bosom and kind of like hairnet and all of the classic cliches of an old working class woman of the times. And she would shout imprecations at people who had not been behaving properly. You know, she was the terror of the neighborhood. But that actually, I think, reflected a time when older women did have that moral authority. So it's not too long ago, from my perspective. That would have been what, kind of 55, 60 years ago when I still saw that happening. So it's not like we're looking back to the dark ages with fairy tales. You know, there are still these characteristics and these places, these kind of pockets where older women have actually been respected. And again, to me, it's just a way of bringing all of that knowledge, whether it's from the old days of the fairy tales or whether it's from the 1960s when I grew up, and just saying, okay, how can we do it better today? Because that feistiness that you're talking about, which my great aunt had in spades, also has to be leavened with wisdom and compassion, doesn't it? So you're not feisty just for the sake of being feisty, but you know when to go in there and insist on being listened to.
Yeah, exactly. I do like that word because it isn't without the second half, but it is then usable.
Yeah, I think you use it better, but it's good, you know, if you've had the inclination as a child, or you've kind of honed it over the years as well, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It's hella useful. What are you most looking forward to in your workshop with Mind, Body, Spirit, and what are the benefits of coming to your workshop?
I think really, for me, it's always exciting to explore those different archetypes and see what people say about how they can imagine it being relevant in their lives today, because that's the heart of it, as I keep saying, you know, that sense of how does it translate into contemporary Britain. And I'm always interested in people's perspective on that in a situation like this where you do get a chance to have the discussion. So what I will be doing is not just talking about old fairy tales, but trying to offer examples of contemporary people. I mean, you know, you've got to offer a range because everybody has different cultural inputs and different ages and so on, and saying, look, here's an example of that. Was that good? Was that bad? How could you have done it better? And so that what I talk about in Hagitude is everybody has within them an inner hag. And how can I encourage everybody? How can I spark their imaginations and inspire them to find a particular inner hag that is theirs? So that is always exciting to me when you kind of see the lights go on in people's faces. It's just like, yes, there is life beyond menopause. And so really that's what I'm looking forward to. That's what I will enjoy about that workshop.
Brilliant. That's amazing. And is there an age limit to that, or would you encourage anyone?
I would absolutely encourage anybody. And what's really interesting when I've talked about Hagitude at book festivals, for example, or other events, is that younger women often come. And when I ask them why, it's very much a sense that they need to believe that there's something worth living for in a world that is just apparently breaking around them. What is there to be, you know? And the story that they are told, just as we were told, that there's nothing beyond menopause, that it's going to get bad and it's going to get worse and then you die. And I think what younger women are looking for
bit of hope.
Yeah, for inspiration, hope, yeah. Hope and inspiration, just that sense of, oh no, I could be that. And almost wanting to be a hag in training, at a very, very early age, which is a wonderful thing.
Exactly. I think I was lucky enough that that's what I thought growing up, because of my nan and because of great aunts and my great nans. And yeah, I was always like, well, that doesn't look like someone wasting away into nothingness. That looks awesome. I can't wait to get there.
Exactly. And when I was a kid reading fairy tales, which I did from a very, very early age, I didn't relate to any of the golden-haired princesses. There were no princesses in the council estate that I grew up on, but there were a lot. Exactly. But there were a lot of old witches, and wow, they was something to think, okay, I could be that one day. I mean, I wouldn't want to be my Aunt Meg because she had many, many flaws, but just that sense that, no, there is some power, there's some energy that it's possible to tap into in old age. And I just love waking people up to that, of all ages.
It's a different type of vivacious sort of energy, but it is there, and it's almost more apparent when you speak to them because they're less physically mobile, I think. So it's this extra spark that comes through conversation and wisdom. And I'm like, oh my God, that's next level vibes, man.
It is next level. But on the other hand, there are also lots of older women who are very quiet. So these fairy tales, I think, really do play to all of our strengths. Not everybody is built to be feisty. And that's not just a cultural repression. It's just the sense of that's not who I am. But there are quiet ways as well to have that influence and to have that import. And that's really, really fine that we get the whole gamut of possibilities.
Impactful for sure. What different cultures have you drawn from with your research and stories and things?
Well, I'm very clear about only using my own culture. Okay. So I only ever work with European myths and fairy tales. I mean, over the years, I've read all kinds of myths and all kinds of fairy tales from different cultures, but it's really important to me that I know what I'm talking about, not just in the sense of what the story says, but where it comes from. So, I could go to America and I talk to lots of Native American elders, but I don't know what a crow is in their mythology. I know what a crow is in my mythology, and it might be something different. The direction of west normally in Europe always means water, because we have that sense of, the Atlantic Ocean over there. West in Native American cultures is not water. Now I can't even remember what it is, but south is water. So, I think you have to have that sense of what the images mean and what this story can authentically be said to mean in your culture. So I'm very scrupulous about that, about not trespassing on somebody else's stories and trying to tell my version of it, because there's something about these stories that are a little bit sacred. They come from the mythic imagination, they come from the other world in our own traditions, and I think it's safest not to mess with them. But what's very interesting about fairy tales and all of the tales that I'll be talking about, they all have similar versions. Every culture in the world has a similar version of a particular tale. So if you tell a particular tale, if you tell, I don't know, the story of the handless maiden, which is about a young woman whose hands are cut off by her father because she refuses to marry the devil so that he can be rich, there is this whole wonderful story of her effectively, after many misadventures, growing her own hands back. You'll always find in pretty much every culture in the world a version of that. Wow. You'll find stories of wicked stepmothers. You'll find stories of abused young women. You'll find everybody has their own version. It's just that the characters wear different clothes and they might eat different food. So I think, even though I am scrupulous about sticking to the European tradition, I think it is relevant all around the world. And I also believe that anybody who comes to this country is partaking, of that kind of old mythology, and it's as relevant to them as it is to anybody else. So I don't really see any of these stories as excluding.
I was going to ask about men learning about it as well.
Sorry, I should.
I don't know. I was going to say, you laughing because that's not even.
No, that's not fair.
By the
no, that's not fair. No, it's really interesting. That I do get a number of men in my audiences at book events, and mostly they sit there looking frightened. And I'm not saying that to just, to be rude about men, but it's just like, normally they're in a room with a bunch of menopausal women who want to find ways to be menopausal, and it's just like, oh my God, what am I doing here? But really, I think men also, I have found throughout my work with If Women Are As Rooted onwards, really want some insight, almost, if it isn't too cliched, what women want. Because that whole role of masculinity back in the day has also crumbled, and they have no idea what to be any more than we have an idea what to be. What is it to be an authentic man is as valid a question as what is it to be an authentic woman. And so I think they're looking for clues as well. And I don't really always understand what men get out of my work, but they do seem to get something. And maybe it is just a sense of somewhere else to go. I mean, I've spoken a lot about how I think the hero's journey has had its day, that swashbuckling kind of linear, let's cut the head off the dragon and save the world kind of, which has made itself into any Hollywood movie that you can imagine. That day is gone. And so I talk a lot about the post-heroic journey, what comes after the hero, and going back to the old stories that tell us more about compassion rather than just brute strength, and community rather than individual glory. And that is true, I think, for women as much as it is for men. Because women have also been told that they must take the hero's journey. In order to succeed, you must act like a man.
Yeah, totally.
So all of us, I think, are looking for these new ways of being and for different stories to live by, men and women. And so I always hope that, although clearly my work is aimed at women, that there is some kind of spillover that's relevant to men too.
Yeah, well, just thinking about men, if they're informed about, we go through a very specific change, and it affects us all in very different ways from, I haven't gone through it, but from what I can see from all the women in my life. And the men have always struggled to support them adequately. And if they were a little bit more informed, perhaps it might be a little easier, or, something, it might give them some strength as well, which would make them feel more like the supporting man.
I think so. And, really, if you look at midlife, if we go back a few years, I suppose midlife these days is kind of the beginning of perimenopause for women. So let's say 35 to 40 is the classic kind of time of midlife, which is premenopause. Men have changes at that time too.
Right.
That's not necessarily hormonal. I think that's just a life stage. And, one of my great influences as a psychologist is Carl Jung. And Jung said that the first half of life is all about building. It's externally focused. It's about creating your persona, creating your place in the world. So building a family if you choose to have one, building a career if you choose to have one, your house, all of that is kind of like, okay, how do I build this kind of external edifice that me sits in? And then he said the second half of life is different. It's for turning inwards. And it's more of a search for meaning and perhaps a search for a spiritual path. And that happens to men as much as it happens to women. The thing for women is that we just kind of think that we're getting started on all of this and we're trying to take it in, and then all of a sudden, bang, menopause, thank you very much. So that's an added thing that men do not have. Men do have hormonal changes. There is no male menopause, not remotely anything like we undergo. But I think there is enough that happens to men in midlife where they're just thinking, what is all this for? Who am I anyway?
Yeah.
That they could, again, if the culture allowed men to have that conversation, they could understand much more of what women go through.
And just to bring in trans people as well, so they would also be going through a stage depending on their their gender at birth. And so, I'm presuming that trans and non-binary people would also benefit greatly from this sort of information.
I would hope so. I mean, I do in Hagitude, I do talk about that and a number of interesting kind of cultural trickster, gender bending characters from, I guess, the first half of the 20th century. And what's interesting is that trickster characters who are great disruptors, the essence of the trickster archetype is to disrupt. So the truth tellers that I was talking about earlier on, they disrupt by telling the truth. But trickster is to disrupt anything that has become stale, that needs breaking effectively so that something else can happen. They almost all are, they switch genders in a flash, just like you would shapeshift in some of the Irish stories. A goddess would be in human form and then would be a crow. A lot of these trickster characters kind of, their disruption is through challenging gender norms. So I think that there is something for everybody in that. But I do think that whoever you think you are in the world, if you think if you think that these old stories can help you, they have something for everybody. Again, they're absolutely not on the basis of excluding, whether that's through kind of where you were born or your race or your gender or anything else. I think there is something absolutely in them for everything. I do think that there are certain stories which may be harder for people from other countries or for people who are not born as a woman to relate to, but I think that's in the absolute minority. What I have always been interested in, and that's probably a project for another day, is how binary and trans people can reimagine those stories so that they're relevant to them, because that's what stories do. They're never static. They always grow and change with culture. The oral tradition did that all the time. You wouldn't find a story being told now the way that it was told 600 years ago. And so I'm always fascinated as to how those stories can transform themselves and shapeshift to accommodate new ways of being in the world. It's so important to be able to do that. So all of what I'm talking about will be absolutely relevant to anybody who chooses to come.
Great. That is exactly the answer I was hoping for.
Good.
Oh, good. What's the link between Hagitude and menopause, and can the knowledge and information in Hagitude help people with their menopause, and how does spirituality come into that?
Well, take the first half of that. Menopause is the transition time for most women. Okay, so that's the real hard, physical, not to be ignored transition time between the first half of life and the second half of life. And I see it as a kind of time between stories. So this is the time when the old story has kind of faded away. Everything that you once thought defined you, your looks, your relationships, your way of being in the world, all of that is kind of in the mix, to put it one way, in menopause. And so I see it as this time between stories, but we're in this terrible period where everything appears to be breaking, everything appears to be going wrong. We're shedding skins, but we don't know what is going to happen next. So we haven't yet grown into the new story. So to me, the ways that I look at menopause are in the context of like alchemy. So in the old traditions of alchemy, something was literally, a substance was literally burned down to the core, to the essence of what was left. And before it was then transformed to become something new. And to me, that's a good way of looking at menopause, as a kind of alchemical process where everything we thought once defined us is stripped away, and that's very frightening. But then there's the exciting bit. Okay, what comes next? What am I going to be next? And that's that kind of construction of a new story for the second half of life, and that feeling that it is a new adventure. It's a new story, a new adventure. So menopause to me is a very uncomfortable but potentially very rich, transformative, alchemical process. And my aim is always to try to convince people of that. And spirituality, really, if I go back to that concept of Carl Jung's, that the second half of life is very much an inward-focused search for meaning, that may be a spiritual thing. For some people, meaning is not a spiritual phenomenon, but for others, it absolutely is. It doesn't have to be a religious phenomenon in the sense of a kind of more formal structure. But I do think that whatever words you want to use around it, when women get to this stage of life where everything is kind of appears to be breaking, it is a spiritual experience, whether you choose to put that word on it or not. You want to know not only what all of the previous years of your life have been for, but what you will be for in these last decades of your life. I mean, remember that back in the day, very few women made it to menopause.
Yeah.
And now we have these extra years of life. And Jung said he firmly believed that we would not have these extra years of life if there wasn't something to be done with them.
Of course.
Because otherwise it would make no sense. It would be pointless. So for me, the question is for every individual, what's to be done with them? What's your inner hag? What's your calling? What's your sense of who you are and the unique gift that you have to give to the world?
Yes. That is a far better spin than what we are asked and told.
Absolutely. That sense that we're useless, that we just, be quiet dear, sit in the corner.
Yeah. They don't even question it or think it. They just, absolutely. Oh no, I'm literally just going to disappear now. Thanks very much. So thank you so much, Sharon, for coming and speaking to me. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I'm very much looking forward to your workshop on Monday the 27th of May at 12:30 at Mind Body Spirit Festival. So for anyone who wants to get tickets, come and see Sharon in person. And we very much look forward to, bringing everyone together in real life. I call it real life nowadays.
Me too, absolutely. I'm really looking forward to it. And thank you so much for some really thoughtful questions.
All right, thank you. And I'll see you soon. Take care. Lots of love. Mwah.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Mind Body Spirit Festival podcast. We would love to connect with you in real person at one of our epic events. Go to mindbodyspiritfestival.co.uk for tickets and information. I will see you there. Don't forget, you can also follow us on Instagram, MBS Wellbeing, for behind the scenes content, updates and offers. Stay cosmic, you beautiful soul.